All right. Hi, everyone who has been joining. Feel free to introduce yourselves. Hi, Maddie. Hi, Jeanette. Jody, Amanda. All right. So, okay. All right. So let's get this started. I am super, super excited to host this session. And I'm honestly blown away by the huge interest that we are seeing. Folks are still arriving, so bear with me while I'm trying to talk and admit everyone. So before we get started, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Anne. I'm facilitating and hosting this conversation today, and I'm a fundraising consultant. What I do is I help solo fundraisers and executive directors without fundraising staff raise more money. So my clients are typically organizations that already have federal grants, state grants, earned revenue from programming, and they are seeking to diversify their funding or bring in new fundraising dollars. And what I help them with is identifying what sort of revenue sources are relevant and how to best invest their time. Because if you have to do it all on your own, right, as a solo fundraiser or executive director without staff, time is very, very scarce. So that's what I do. And if you're interested in learning more, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I always love connecting with folks. And I also host a fundraising Facebook community called Fundraising for Busy Nonprofit Executives. I just put the link in the chat. And it's a community about 800 executive directors for the most part. And I provide content, you can ask questions, and I also have, fun prompts to put the fun back into fundraising. That is kind of my mission. Yeah, so the question is, of course, why this topic? I mean, apparently this topic is extremely relevant to many of you. But in order to get us started, I wanted to tell you a story. And the story is actually my own story. I used to be the executive director of a small nonprofit organization in Germany, and our budget was around $250,000. And our main source of revenue was actually government grants and federal funding. And when I came to the US, I wasn't quite sure how would I fit into the local nonprofit scene, and found this amazing organization called Boston Scores, where I also met Vanessa. And I took on the role as a grants manager because I thought, okay, I know how to write grants. I mean, that's what I've been doing for a long time. And so I was responsible for raising around $500,000 through private grants from family foundations and corporate foundations. And coming from federal funding or government funding overall, my idea on what success depended on in order to be a successful grant writer was that it all depends on the writing. And just 20% is about the relationship, right? So if you've ever written a federal grant, it's usually a huge endeavor, and grants or proposals are evaluated by an independent committee, and it's not really possible to build a true relationship with the decision makers, right? So that's how I understood grant writing. And because I wanted to be really good at this, I invested a lot of time in becoming a better writer. So I learned how to, increase or improve my grammar. I learned how to write copy, and I basically signed up for every single grant writing class that I could find. And as a result, I think I became a pretty decent writer. But the problem was that I did not see the financial returns on all that effort I put into becoming a better writer. And that's when it slowly dawned on me that private grants operate entirely differently than federal, state, or government grants overall. Private grants are fundraising, and fundraising is all about relationships. So what I thought success depended on, which is that it's all about the writing and a little bit about the relationship and the alignment with the funder, was actually untrue. What I learned was that private grants are highly determined. Your success in private grant writing is highly determined by the relationship that you have, the funder, and the way you can use that relationship to understand your alignment, the alignment of your organization with the priorities of the funder. So that's why it's so important. And the writing is actually only a smaller piece of the pie, right, of your overall success. And yeah, so that's what I learned. The problem was I was still super uncomfortable with this whole idea of approaching funders. So I found it super awkward because of the inherent power dynamic that probably many of us struggle with. I was wondering, how do I even get in front of a funder, right? Because many foundations don't even accept unsolicited proposals, or they have specified grant guidelines that don't include the recommendation to reach out. And most of all, I was also wondering, so if I get in front of a funder, what do I even say? What is expected of me? And that's why I'm so excited for this session today. And before we get started, and before I want to introduce Vanessa of the ALKU Foundation, let me give you a brief overview how this webinar is going to take place. So first, we are going to answer the questions that you submitted. We will not be able to answer all the 150 questions that were submitted, but we consolidated them, and we will touch upon the ALKU Foundation. Who are they? How do they fund? Who do they fund? We will understand how to build and maintain a funder relationship with the ALKU Foundation, but also on a more general note. We will discuss funder expectations during the grant application process, but also outside of the application process. And then if you still have questions, we will open it up for a Q&A session at the end. And that should be around 2:45, potentially earlier. We'll see how the conversation goes. Yeah, so let me stop sharing and hand it over to Vanessa. So Vanessa, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little more about you and your story?
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to be reunited with Anne after working together for many years. So I have been working in the nonprofit field for about 20 years in fundraising. So most recently, director of philanthropy at Boston Scores. Prior to that at Mass Mentoring Partnership. And having kind of been on that side of things, I'm very kind of grateful to be able to use that experience now that I've made the transition to the other side of philanthropy. So I am the first executive director of the ALKU Foundation, which is a private family foundation that lives within a corporation. ALKU is a specialty consulting firm in Andover. The family or the couple that founded the organization wanted to do more to give back and started the Family Foundation last year. A little bit about the foundation. We support organizations in Massachusetts that are youth serving, so direct service youth development organizations, whether that's mentoring, after school programming, community-based programs. And our grants are on the smaller side. So we're really focused on organizations that have smaller budgets, kind of in the $2.5 million and under. We just feel like that's where we're making most of our impact. And one thing that's really important to me and the family that serves as the board of directors for the foundation is that we are doing trust-based philanthropy. So unrestricted grants, we currently don't have an application process. It's very much focused on relationship building and building a partnership with the nonprofits doing the work. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into some of the questions, but I'm excited to be here and kind of share a funder's perspective.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And speaking from the perspective of a former grants manager, I think this conversation would have helped me so much avoid some of the mistakes that I made and also become more comfortable with this whole process. So What I really love about your story is that you've been switching sides from grant seeking or from fundraising, actively fundraising, to making grants and providing funding to the nonprofit sector. So if you can talk to us a little more about what that has been like for you, that sort of switch.
Awesome. Yeah, I could talk about this all day long. I feel like you're doing similar work, but there is such a power imbalance and inequity kind of being from the funding perspective to the, grant seeking perspective, that it became very obvious to me that a lot of the practices that we're used to on the fundraising side, it's not balanced. And, that I don't know, if raise your hand if you've ever stayed up till midnight on a Friday, completing a 48-page application, and submitting metrics and data that isn't really truly relevant to your program, but it's what the funder wants to see. So I think that, a lot of the fundraising, the philanthropy, the practices that have been in place for so long, the folks that are doing the grant making have been so removed from the process, that there are a lot of things in place that are just not necessary. Like, in order for a private family foundation to give a grant, I don't actually need, certain metrics to be, filing with the IRS or anything when we do our 990s. So it's been very interesting to kind of see like what is required and what is something that a funder, would just like to see, and what makes that their priority and how they're making those decisions. So it's also helped kind of for us shape like what we do want to see and what we don't think is necessarily a requirement or is a burden on the organization submitting those grants. But yeah, what a position of privilege to be able to have been on both sides and understand where grant seekers are really coming from when they do apply for those grants.
That is awesome. I'm sure that many of us in this room who have applied for grants before really, really appreciate your very innovative approach of not requiring that traditional way of submitting a grant, a full-blown grant application. So if you want to tell us a little more about what the application process is actually like.
Sure. Well, for us, there is no application. So if someone is interested, if anyone on this call feels like your organization would be a fit for the ALKU Foundation funding, you can check out our website. We have our guidelines on there. I kind of ran through them earlier, but otherwise it's really about reaching out. You fill out a contact us form on our website, or you shoot us an email. I'm the only staff person. I get all the emails that come in through the website. I ask for 5 days to get back to you, trying to kind of keep within that deadline, but it's about having that conversation. I think that I'll do the research and I'll pull, your forms and see what your budgets are like and make sure that you fit within that area of giving that we're looking at. We also try to be super transparent. So if someone reaches out and they don't kind of fit into our areas, I try to say that right away so that you're not, wasting time and trying to prepare for a meeting. I'm always still willing to meet, as the philanthropy world, especially in Boston or Massachusetts, is pretty small, and you just never know who's going to know who. I think there's an interesting kind of idea about this like competitive piece where it's like, oh, well, if you're going for that grant, and what about this one? But truly, we're all just trying to serve the same populations or, slightly different. But I think, being able to connect and have that conversation and understand the work that you're doing. And then if it fits, then we move on from there. It's not a complicated process. Typically, it's one more meeting or a site visit or, a grant, an award being made. So for us, it's a pretty simple, straightforward process at this time. And I'm hoping we'll never do traditional applications or reporting in that way.
Wow, that's truly awesome. And I think you touched upon a really important point, why it is of really a big advantage to reach out to a funder, because you said, the funder landscape. These are all your peers. So you can easily make recommendations or even introductions. And I think this is what I personally would want to see philanthropy to be like. And that is also a big mindset shift that I had to make after a while, or that I made after a while, which is that at the end of the day, it's one community. We are working towards the same thing, right? And that removed a lot of the anxiety between that power imbalance for me personally. So lots of relevant topics there. I had another question. So, of course, we are often faced with organizations. I mean, not everyone is as avant-garde, I want to say, as the ALKU Foundation. So many foundations do not accept unsolicited proposals, or they have, as I mentioned earlier, they have grant guidelines on their website where they say, submit your proposal via our portal, and don't necessarily highlight or mention specifically that you should reach out to them. So what do you do in this case, when there is no official way to reach out, or if they specify, just submit your proposal and we'll get back to you? What would you recommend?
I mean, I think submitting a proposal blindly is risky. I mean, just with your time, like I've heard from folks who have submitted applications to some of the, the larger if you think of like a Bar Foundation or the Boston Foundation, Amelia Peabody, Cummings, these organizations, they're receiving hundreds of applications. And we all know, like, an application is not just cutting and pasting, like you're customizing it, you're highlighting certain programs, you're aligning it with the funder's mission and what they want to support. And the applications are burdensome and lengthy, and you're pulling information from, people in finance and budgets and evaluation. And that is so time consuming that I would not recommend just filling out an application and kind of hoping that is one of 20 selected out of 500. For me, that isn't a great use of time. I would always recommend trying to reach out to the funder if they don't have information posted, or if you can't reach someone. I wouldn't submit blindly until you have spoken to someone. I also like who you know. So if you're connected with your board members on LinkedIn, you can look for trustees from different foundations or folks that are connected and see if they can make an introduction. I know that for me, if someone's like, oh, hey, I know your boss, or I know someone, I'm like, all right, like I'm going to respond to everyone anyways, but it definitely moves them to the top of the list. So I think that being able to make that connection is huge. And also knowing, like, when you reach out to the funder or a program manager or someone, especially at these bigger ones, they should be able to give you a clear idea of, if you support a variety of programs, or if you're working in a variety of programs at your organization, they'll be able to tell you, like, we really want to, support programs that are working with high school students or with elderly or, food insecurity, these different areas, so that you're not just writing more broadly and not really hitting on what they're looking for. So I think that asking those pointed questions about, well, what would be of most interest for your funding priorities? Would it be this program, or what do your trustees want to see? How do you really hone in on what's important to move on to that stage where you're getting funding from them? I hope that's helpful, but I definitely, making that connection, like having your name kind of pop up so that you're moving to the top of the list, is huge, just because a lot of these, funders received just hundreds of applications. Yeah,
thank you for that. And that really gels with my experience as well, because it's not only been once that I reached out to a funder only to learn that their funding guidelines were actually outdated, which they had posted on the website, or there was a specific trustee with a particular weight in the decision-making process, and they wanted to support a specific aspect of the funding guidelines or of the work of the foundation. And I think something that might also be relevant to answer that question. So how can I build a relationship if there is no official, I always call it the front door and back door, right? So there is no front door. ALKU has a great front door. So how to get through the back door? What is the back door? And you mentioned LinkedIn. And there are a variety of ways of finding out who the trustees are. And you mentioned that, right? Finding their 990s. Or another way, every foundation 990 has listed the trustees. And most of the times, actually, 990s have also listed who else receives funding from a specific funder. So that would be another way, to understand what are funding priorities. How does, the funding guideline might not represent necessarily what the foundation actually does. And in seeing who else gets funding and for what do they get funding gives you additional insight. And not only that, you might know one of the grantees of that organization or that foundation that you would like to receive funding from. And you can reach out and say, hey, do you have any recommendations how we might be considered for grants as well? Again, we are all one community. I don't believe in competition in the nonprofit sector. We are all working towards the same thing. And so even if that sounds a little bit, weird, I really deeply believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say, right? So that's awesome. Yeah, so you mentioned, and I think we got a question here in the chat, but I'll look at the chat as we're getting to the Q&A piece of it. So now we built a relationship. We know how to get in front of a funder. Now the question is, how are decisions made? And how are they made at the ALKU Foundation? And also, what do you see with your peers?
Yeah, so I think that it's very different depending on the organization, the size, how involved the trustees are. A corporate foundation, from my experience, runs very differently, where there's a lot of employee involvement or review committees from the employees that work there. So I think it can be anything from traditionally, when you apply, there's maybe like one season or one kind of application cycle, or maybe two. It takes a few months. There's a review committee or a board. There's often a site visit or an application to, or an invitation to apply after an LOI. We are, because we serve smaller organizations where I think cash flow is often an issue, we try to work very quickly. We don't have a cycle. We don't have applications per se, but we work with organizations on a rolling basis. So every month we try to distribute funds, and and it's if there's something larger, I talk to my board about it. We meet every 3 months, but otherwise I have access to my boss. So if I have a question, I'm like, how do we feel about this? We can just reach out, but we try to, because they're smaller, we act quickly and can make decisions usually within a couple of weeks, which I think can be very helpful, especially for smaller organizations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that is really amazing to hear that you focus on funding grassroots organizations as well. So that's highly appreciated, I think, in the overall landscape, where, of course, there is a kind of bias against smaller organizations who might not have the capacity to write grants and who might not have the track record that many of the larger foundations or more established organizations require to see. So I think that's awesome. So one question that I often receive and that I'm really curious to hear your perspective on is, can you address the concern of what if I ask too high of an amount? Will that disadvantage me?
That's a great question. And I think the way to avoid that is by looking up a foundation's 990. And I think there you can see the grants that they've given and the average size, and also just having that conversation. So our grants are typically small in the $5,000 range. We have gone to 10, 15, and 20 for a variety of circumstances, but typically we do start around 5K. So if I did have a conversation with someone and they were like, well, we'd really love you for, love it if you funded us at 50K. It wouldn't disadvantage of them, but I just would be like, oh, you didn't look at our website, or like, you didn't look at our forms. So I think just doing your research so that you know kind of what can be expected, and you can see on a 990 form how much they've distributed and what the amounts are. So if you've seen that they've given 25K and that's kind of their standard, it's between 20 and 25, I would ask within that range, especially as a first-time grant partner, as asking over just wouldn't really make sense with that amount. And just, I should mention there's a newer kind of website. There's like GuideStar and Candid and the Giving Common and all these sites where you can do this research and pull the 990s and, research nonprofits and foundations alike. There's a new one called Impala, which I love, as it's free for 2 years for nonprofits and foundations in Massachusetts. Sorry for those who are not in Massachusetts, but through a partnership with Philanthropy Massachusetts and the Barr Foundation. And you can go in and search for a funder and what programs they're funding. From a grant, from a nonprofit's perspective, it would have been really useful for me at the time to be able to say, okay, say I work at Boston Scores, which is a youth development through sports after school program in the Boston public school system, and then looking at like what other programs are doing similar work. So there's, Tenacity that does, tennis, youth development. There's the Base that does youth development through baseball. There's all these other organizations that are kind of doing similar work. So being able to look at those and see who's funding them and then kind of find funders through that way can be very helpful. So just one kind of like piece of advice to kind of check that out, because it can make it kind of easier to pull a prospect list and then from there start reaching out and making those connections.
Yeah, I agree. And I just posted, Impala or the name of the platform into the chat. There is also another platform which I typically recommend, especially to smaller organizations who might not have access to instrumental or GuideStar. It's called grantmakers.io. I don't know why it's not more popular. It's all free, and it basically has the same sort of services or same sort of insights that instrumental would have. So yeah, that's definitely a good recommendation. So now we built the relationship, we submitted our proposal, we have heard from the foundation, from you, we got the grant or we didn't get the grant. Let's say if we got the grant, what is a funder expectation of how we, how to communicate and interact outside of the grant cycle, or outside of the application phase, in between, between the application, funding agreement, and then the reporting. What would you recommend, or what is your expectation, or your recommendation on what to do as a grantee?
Awesome. And this was always such a hot topic for us, where it's like, how many touch points throughout the year? Like, what are we inviting them to? We don't want to bombard funders, but we want them to feel connected and engaged in our work. I mean, I love hearing from grant partners. There's definitely some that are less, communicative and they receive a donation and we get some updates, and that's great. But for me, I would love to be able to come see your work in action. I'd love to be able to come and celebrate your youth as they're graduating from a program or moving on to a next step. I love to receive newsletters. I like to be invited to galas and events. Like, I can't go to all of them. And there's definitely some restrictions where, we can't fund them or sponsor tickets. But it's, I want to be engaged and understand the work. And I think funders do, it's really about creating partnerships, or the hope is that most funders do want to create those partnerships and see the work in action and hear candidly, like, what are some of the challenges? I think it's our responsibility to be transparent and accountable to our grant partners as they are to us. So being able to be partners in that work is great. So I think I typically hear from folks maybe every other month or so. Some it's much more often, I'll get like a photo from a program that they ran, or an update, or a quote, or an invitation, or like, let's meet for coffee and catch up. So I don't think there's ever too much. I mean, unless you're like reaching out weekly or something, but I think as a grant partner, you can also ask the funder, like, what would you like? What's your communication style? It's a little bit like dating and trying to figure out what's working for both parties. And, is a phone call best, or is it coffee, or is it an email update? But yeah, you can always ask them, but I'd say every couple months, it's great to kind of be reminded, and it takes the pressure off of the nonprofits too. You don't want to just be reaching out when you're asking for something. You want to be top of mind. And ideally that's a two-way conversation, and not, just the grant partner asking. But yeah, that would be my thoughts.
Great. That's good to hear, because that was certainly a question that was on my mind. How much communication is too much? What do foundations, grant makers expect? But how I see the grantee and grant maker relationship is, as you said, as a partnership, right? And something that I also understood is that foundations are actually also nonprofit organizations with their own missions, right? And you, as you with your organization also have a mission, and it's all about finding that sort of overlap. If you think in terms of a Venn diagram of your mission and the foundation's mission, and ideally you would submit a proposal that, is in that overlap between your two missions, right? And that's, so you're working towards the same goal, and that is sort of the mindset and dynamic where you would be coming from. And something else, at the end of the day, funders are, and again, I'm speaking more from my personal anxieties and misperceptions that I had back in the days. Funders are just people, right? They're just people like Vanessa and I, and they enjoy a warm note from you as you reach out and tell them about the great stories that came out of your program, and the great impact that you're making. So it just makes us feel good, and we are all humans at the end of the day, on whichever side we sit on our desks. So let me see. So we built the relationship, we got the funding, we are communicating throughout the year. So the last question is basically, or the last sort of bucket of questions that we got was, so what about reporting? What are best practices in terms of reporting? And I think you touched on it already just now with your answer, but what I often hear is, how much data, how much stories, should it be a mix? What is important to you, and what would you generally recommend?
Mm-hmm. That's great. And that's, again, I recommend asking the funder, because they might be like, here's a report, like here's a template, and this is what I want to hear from you, so that they can kind of take that information and give it to their board, or whatever it is that they do with it. But I've had folks ask me, like, what's important to you? Is it the data, the metrics, like which ones? Is it the stories? For me personally, it's the stories. It's like really, it's humanizing the programs and being like, these are students that we've served. And this is, this one youth and how they came into the program. And then here's a quote from them now, or here's a photo of them, paying it forward, or helping someone else, or like creating change in their community. So for me, that's what makes me feel good. And that's what, I can share those stories with our board, and we feel like we're making an impact. We're helping a program, do good in the community and to help people. But for others, it might not be that, they might want to see graduation rates, or, social emotional skills, or different areas where your constituents are improving or changing, or whatever that may be. So I think everyone loves the feel good stories, but also, just talk to the funder and see what it is that they want to see. I think in an ideal world, you should be able to reuse reports. I think reporting can be burdensome and can take a long time. So if you're kind of creating one for one funder, ideally other funders will be like, that's fine, just like send it over to us. But those are questions that you need to have with those funders. Because it's going to be different from person to person.
Yeah. And I remember those funders who have very strict guidelines on what they exactly want to see in terms of impact measurements, which not necessarily always fit with what we actually measured, or how we define success. So while I can understand that from a funder perspective, of course, that puts nonprofit organizations at a disadvantage sometimes, or at least poses several challenges. Mm-hmm. Something else that came to my mind is that oftentimes I also hear the question, so, I mean, stories are great, but I don't have space to write long stories. I mean, you're usually faced with character restrictions and, restrictive forms and portals, right? And what I usually recommend is to think stories not in terms of, a story of, Rapunzel or something, something very lengthy, but a story can literally be one sentence, right? Janelle joined our program in 2018 as a really shy girl. And after our coach made her the captain of the team, she became super outgoing and is now, surrounded by friends, and as she has lunch in the canteen or something, I mean, that was not the most beautiful prose, but, you see a story can, I always recommend stories as a backup to numbers, and a story doesn't have to be long. So that's my point. They bring data to life. So that's why I think they're really, really important. Okay, so where are we? So, okay, we built the relationship, we got the funding, we communicated with the funder, and now we are reporting on our progress. So I think we can now open it up to the Q&A. So if you have any questions that are not answered yet, feel free to post them in the chat, and I'm trying to see who has submitted a question and how we can best answer them. Okay. So I see this as good advice for grant seekers, but a huge caveat for grant makers. So Kathy, I'm not sure what your question at 223 referred to. There is an.
Would you like me to make it more clear?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So, for example, when we think about hiring, we think about the kinds of bias we have in hiring, and we often advise job seekers to find people they know to find jobs. And this is good advice for job seekers. But for employers who want to be diverse, equitable, and just, the advice is not just to go on relationships. And so if grant makers are going on, and I have been in tiny organizations earlier in my career, and we're always told about, how to leverage relationships and so forth. But those kinds of organizations that I worked with early in my career could never build those kinds of relationships. I'm not going to talk about all the barriers, but there are barriers. Then one day I moved to a different sphere, and I worked for an organization where we were looking for money from the Bar Foundation. And my boss walked me into the Bar Foundation, and we had a lovely, cordial conversation. And of course, they gave us money. And I understood immediately that it's about privilege. That's what I want to say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
Vanessa,
I want to hear on your side how if you're building, for example, if ALKU is building based on relationships, and if you're advising grant seekers to build on relationships, how are we advising the grant makers to work against this kind of bias?
That's a great question. And I think that grant makers have a way to come. or way to go. And I'm definitely seeing, having been on this side now for, it hasn't even been a year, but there is a privilege. Like I'm being invited to like CEOs of family foundation meetings, funder cohorts, collaborative efforts. And honestly, the first time I stepped into one of these rooms, there was all these funders, all these EDs of foundations that had been ignoring me for the last 17 years. It was mildly embarrassing to be like, oh, hi, that was me, that would like keep knocking on your door and sending messages and leaving voicemails. But I am seeing that folks are coming around. Like there are new foundations, they're doing things differently. I think foundations are getting a little bit wiser about bringing in people who have nonprofit experience, and aren't just like, oh, it's a family member that's running it, or someone, from the corporate world who doesn't have that experience. There's a lot of things that need, from my perspective, that need to change. There's a lot of like the bigger foundations, they have a process. And I know we're saying build a relationship. That's such a big piece of it. Like, who do you know? But there's also some foundations that no one will ever be able to crack into because they've been funding the same programs for the last 20 years. They're not bringing in new programs. No amount of relationship is going to change that. But I do see this like new wave of funders that are being more receptive, that are trying to be in the community more, that are trying to partner with organizations and not just be a traditional funder where they're like, here's a check, reapply in a year. But I think that the landscape of philanthropy still has a long ways to come. I can only really speak to Massachusetts, but yeah, there's a ways to go. But I am hearing more and more people talking about trust-based philanthropy, where 5 years ago, I don't know if I had ever heard of that, like having been on the nonprofit side. So I feel like people are talking about it. Not everyone, people are trying to be more, create an equal system where it's not this power imbalance. They are trying to take the burden off of the nonprofits. I'm very much hoping it's like this new wave that's coming, but I do think that there is a ways to go for that.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Vanessa. And I think the question is also, so if funders don't accept unsolicited proposals, right? So they would go out and search for potential grantees, right? Let's say Mackenzie Scott used to do that until she opened her portal just yesterday, was it? Or the day before yesterday. And I'm curious to hear, do you know from your peers how that usually works, or what that approach is like?
Was that for me, Anne? Sorry, can you?
Yeah, that was actually for you. Yeah, so
okay.
There are some foundations who go out, right, and seek out their grantees, just like Mackenzie Scott. Right. And I'm wondering whether you know anything about how they approach that.
I don't. And it's interesting because I know there's a funder south of Boston who did this like $1 million a week. And I'm just like, who's doing the work and who's doing the research and who's talking to these programs and, giving $1 million, like anyone would love to get $1 million grant, but it's like, can the organization scale? Like if they're raising 800,000 and they suddenly get $1 million, like what are the plans for that? Like how are we supporting those nonprofits? So I don't know, when there's like a big, $1 million for this and $1 million for that. I would love to know the people behind it kind of doing the work and the research, just because the programs they support seem to vary so much. I know for us, like we get a lot of our grant partners that come in through the website. I also, reach out to like, someone at the Summer Fund through Philanthropy Massachusetts, and at BASB, Boston After School and Beyond, and Mass Mentoring Partnership, these groups that work with a variety of nonprofit organizations and kind of have a pulse on the work happening in those areas. There's funder collaboratives on the Cape and in Western Mass, and trying to better understand, who these programs are. I think that's how I've learned about a lot of these smaller ones that don't have a website. They're not they don't have a grant writer, they don't have a development person. It's like one executive director who, and like volunteers. So kind of making sure that we're working with other people in the community who know the work that's happening there, since we can't be on the ground everywhere, I think is really important. And it doesn't always happen. I think that's one of the fun parts about being like a small, there's grassroots nonprofits, and we're kind of doing the grassroots funding thing and trying to get, our hands in the work and better understand the people doing the work in the communities that maybe don't have the resources that some of the other organizations do.
That's definitely a good point. And great to hear that you and your peers are actively networking with other nonprofit networks that might be able to point out specific organizations and hopefully advance equity. I mean, what I've seen, especially also with Philanthropy Massachusetts, I think I saw Phyllis on here, that they are actually actively promoting and helping bring the conversation around DEIB into the philanthropy space. So I think we all have a long way to go. We won't, we all agree on that, but I am optimistic, and talking to Vanessa makes me even more optimistic that we are on the right path.
I have a question. I know I'm just popping in here, but I was hoping that maybe Vanessa would be able to hear this as well, so I can be real brief. So I'm not a grant writer. I'm learning all of this from the very beginning. So I work with a nonprofit called Adult and Teen Challenge. And so we're located in Western Mass in Worcester. And so my focus is really trying to get funding from foundations for our long-term residential treatment center. And it has been hard because I don't know the foundations that are out there, the meetings that I need to be at, where I need to be, because I know my testimony and the reasons why is powerful, but to be in front of those people, like you said, the 80% is the relationship when it comes to private foundations. I've never done anything on a state or a federal level. So these are all brand new, but I know when I get in front of a foundation and share my testimony and the heart for the organization, they fund us. And so I just need someone to help me, in hopes that the people that are here that can hear, and Vanessa as well, that we would be able to set up private opportunities where I could learn something, and also, outside of Impala, maybe be able to learn where there's some funding that I can gear myself to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm obviously happy to connect with you and give you some pointers on how to approach, finding grant makers that are relevant for your work. Outside of that, I mean, as we were just talking about nonprofit networks, there is the Nonprofit Center of the Berkshires. So if you're in Western Mass, you might be in their vicinity. And that might be a good way to build your relationships also with other nonprofit organizations. And then, as you said, Impala, Instrumental, grantmakers.io have great search functions where you can search for foundations and grant makers that might be relevant for the specific type of work that you do. And again, if you want to connect afterwards or on LinkedIn, happy to help.
And did you say you were in Worcester, Steve?
Yes, we're in Worcester.
Okay, does the Worcester Community Foundation might be a good resource as well?
Okay. Yeah, I did have, I had, the Fuller Foundation and Mr. Alden Trust come and do walkthroughs, and those were the personals. I waited out front of their office until they came and said, hey, here I am. I know you probably won't like this, but please come by. I want to tell you about what's changed my life and how you can make a difference. And they were like, okay, we'll give you 5 minutes. And then it turned into, I love what you do. Here's a little, here's something, let's talk about next year. So the hope is that I'll know where to go. And we're the only long-term treatment center in Berkshire County as well. So we're outside of that in Worcester, but we take them from there and we don't turn anyone away. So knowing that there's something in Berkshire County where I can reach out to for funding is all very huge. I mean, we haven't gotten any grants in Massachusetts since I've been a director here. And so it'll be really, really nice to connect and learn and grow and be able to establish.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for the question and good luck. Okay, so I want to move on with the questions. We had a question here from Katie. She's asking, would you be able to provide a list of some questions to ask or some questions to avoid when cold calling, trying to build a relationship with funders? What would you say, Vanessa?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of.
So you mentioned a couple, and I was actually just wondering if you had jotted them down because I was trying to type while you were talking and I did not catch all of them.
Well, I think we're recording the session, so if that's sent out to everyone, we'll be able to capture some of those. But yeah, I think I don't know how relevant this is, but for me, I was always super anxious, like as the director of philanthropy, director of development, like anytime I had to reach out to a funder or a major donor or a corporate sponsor, kind of until I made that connection, it felt very much like, okay, like I'd have to like build myself up. And I know, Anna, you were the same, where we'd be like, okay, like we have a funder coming in, we're going to put on our ill-fitting suits and pull people out of programming and, create these presentations with numbers that weren't really important to us, but it was important to the funder. And I think it was until you started to connect, or I started to connect on a more personal level, like not necessarily personal, like talking about my kids or anything, but I mean, that's great too. But I think you're building a relationship. So once you get to the point where, you're meeting with someone and you're seeing them, whether it's over coffee or whatever it is, and you can do the chit chat and you know enough about them, and you have that personal connection, that's when the like nervousness of like, how do I connect and how do we do this? And I think looking at a funder's website, like if you look at our website, you know that we're all really passionate about youth development, whether that's mentoring or after school programs. So that's a great conversation starter. If your organization's doing that work, kind of being like, I really want to tell you about this thing, or I wanted to share with you this recent event that happened and how great it was, or one of our kids just went on to, graduate from college and they're the first in their family. So sharing that information, the hope is that the funder, if they're also interested, will be like, oh, that's great. Like, I want to hear more about it. Tell me more. That reminds me of something else. And just really breaking down the pretenses and the positions of power, and just being like, we're normal people and we want to both, create positive change and impact, and finding those ways to connect kind of on a more personal level, I think has really helped, with that, like, oh, how do we do this? How do we start this conversation out?
Yeah. I want to underline everything that you said. I mean, you know best, obviously. So one question, or the way I often started off conversations with grant makers, was that I asked them about their personal connection to our mission. And that worked, so we were a sports-based, soccer-based after-school program. And what I usually asked was, so did you play any sports growing up? And most of them had some sort of, or do you keep fit, or how do you keep fit? And most grant makers that I spoke to could immediately empathize with that, and the value of physical fitness and being active and sports, and what sort of sports played in their personal development. So that was for me a great way to, build this personal relationship and to get the anxiety out of it. I think honestly, from my perspective, there is really no such thing as a wrong question, because I think at the end of the day, if this is not a fit between you and the foundation, that's fine. I mean, there are so many foundations out there, so many grant makers out there, and we don't have to, I mean, there is enough out there, and it's fine. You can't fit a square peg into a round hole. That's what I want to say. So if it's not a fit, if the conversation doesn't go well, if you don't align with your mutual missions, that's fine. Just go out, find a different funder, and I'm sure you will find the right fit. So I wouldn't stress too much about asking a wrong question.
I found
that works across the board. I'm sorry. I found that works across the board, whether it's someone that I'm trying to cultivate as an individual, whether they are people that are going to come out from a large funding organization to do a site visit. The first thing I ask them is about them, like what connects you? And I find that everyone in our space is so passionate about that compelling story that they want to share that. And we can always take bits from that, but asking them about themselves is, to me, just the absolute most genuine way to start any conversation. And it's so interesting that it's easy to be genuine and authentic.
Right. That's the heart of fundraising. Thank you for highlighting that. Okay, so we are coming on time, but I want to highlight one question because I think it got an upvote, and I know a lot of smaller organizations really struggle breaking into the foundation world. So Vanessa, do you have any recommendations for small grassroots organizations with low budgets under $250,000? We aren't eligible to apply for many grants because of this. Any recommendations?
I mean, I would say check out some of those free resources, see what other organizations similar to yours are doing to get funding and from who. I mean, there's no reason that those organizations should not be funded at the same kind of pace or level as other organizations that are raising more money, right? That just seems like, I know it's a stumbling block and it can be preventative, but I think that, seeing who are your peers, what are they doing, collaboration. So I think if you're in the same space as another organization, you can ask them to help make introductions to funders. But yeah, I think it's about the research, about making connections, reaching out for conversations. I can't speak for all funders, but even if someone does not fit into our giving guidelines, if they want to reach out and have a conversation, if they, want some advice on how to approach others or what they could be doing differently. I know there's, Anne will help with that. I am happy to look at things. So I think don't be afraid just to reach out and, ask to have a conversation. The worst they can do is not respond, which will maybe happen, but hopefully people will be responsive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add another idea would also be to seek collaboration with another nonprofit organization that is larger than you and see whether you can do something like a joint application. So with that being said, it's 3 p.m. and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I really, really hope it was helpful to all of you in here. I thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope to stay in touch. Vanessa, any last words?
I have not been keeping up with the chat. The one time I tried to do that, I got very distracted and didn't hear the question. So if I missed any direct messages that came through the chat, if you want to connect, please feel free. Just check out the ALKUFoundation.org or message through that. I'm happy to connect with anyone, connect on LinkedIn. If I'm connected to someone that would be helpful, don't be afraid to ask for that introduction. But yeah, I just won't have a chance to see all those before we log off. So thanks everyone for your time and joining us.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I will send out the recording. So if you missed something, don't fret. You'll get the recording. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.